The saloon doors of the Dusty Rose swung with their familiar creak as Eleanor Whitmore pressed herself against the weathered wood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Through the grimy window, she could see Harold's imposing figure dismounting his horse, his face twisted with the familiar rage that had driven her to flee their marriage 3 months ago. The divorce papers in her reticule felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, but they were her only hope of freedom from a man who refused to accept that their union was over. "Please." "God, not here," she whispered, her gloved hands trembling as she adjusted her traveling dress. The small frontier town of Redemption Creek was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place where Harold would never think to look for her. She'd been wrong. The saloon buzzed with the usual evening crowd, miners fresh from the hills, cattle drivers passing through, and local merchants drowning their sorrows in whiskey. Eleanor had never set foot in such an establishment before her flight from Boston. But desperate times had taught her that propriety was a luxury she could no longer afford. Harold's voice boomed from outside, questioning the stable boy about a woman matching her description. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She needed to disappear, and fast. That's when she saw him, sitting alone at a corner table. A man in black leather chaps and a worn Stetson nursed a glass of amber liquid. His face was partially shadowed, but she could see the strong line of his jaw and the way his fingers, long and surprisingly elegant, wrapped around his glass. There was something about his stillness that spoke of coiled danger, like a rattlesnake sunning itself on a rock. Without thinking, Eleanor rushed toward him, her desperation overriding every lesson in propriety her mother had ever drilled into her head. "Please," she gasped, reaching for his hand. "I need your help." The stranger's head snapped up, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds and a face that belonged in a Renaissance painting rather than a frontier saloon. For a moment, time seemed suspended as their gazes locked. His hand was warm and calloused beneath her gloved fingers, and she felt an unexpected jolt of electricity at the contact. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, with a slight drawl that sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. "My ex-husband," she whispered urgently, glancing toward the doors. "He's outside. He's been following me for weeks and I—" Her voice broke. "Please just pretend you know me. Just for a few minutes." The stranger studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. Then without warning, he stood and pulled her closer, his arm sliding around her waist with practiced ease. "Well, darling," he said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby patrons to hear, "you sure took your sweet time getting here. I was starting to think you'd changed your mind about our little arrangement." Eleanor's eyes widened at his boldness, but before she could protest, the saloon doors burst open. Harold strode in, his expensive Eastern clothes and polished boots marking him as clearly as a neon sign in this rough establishment. His pale eyes swept the room like a hawk searching for prey. "Easy now," the stranger murmured against her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Just follow my lead." Harold's gaze found them, and his face darkened with fury. "Eleanor! There you are, you foolish woman. This charade has gone on long enough." The stranger's arm tightened protectively around her waist. "I'm sorry, friend, but I think you've got the wrong lady. This here's my woman, and she's been with me all evening." "Your woman?" Harold's voice rose to a near shriek. "That's my wife." "Ex-wife," Eleanor found her voice, lifting her chin defiantly. "The papers are signed and filed, Harold. We're through." A dangerous silence fell over the saloon. Even the piano player had stopped his tinkling melody. Harold's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, a weapon Eleanor knew he barely knew how to use but carried for intimidation. The stranger noticed the movement too. In one fluid motion, he stepped slightly in front of Eleanor, his own hand resting casually on the grip of a well-worn Colt .45. The gesture was subtle, but every man in the saloon understood its meaning. "Now, mister," the stranger said, his voice still conversational but carrying an edge that made Eleanor's skin prickle. "I suggest you turn around and walk out that door." The lady's made her feelings clear, and I'd hate for this to get unpleasant. Harold's face cycled through several shades of red and purple. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I'm Harold Whitmore of the Boston Whitmores." "I have connections, influence, and I'm just a simple cowboy," the stranger replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But out here, friend, that don't mean much. What matters is that the lady don't want your company." For a moment, Eleanor thought Harold might actually draw his weapon. Then, perhaps sensing the mood of the room, or the predatory stillness of the man beside her, he stepped back. "This isn't over, Eleanor," he snarled. "You can't hide behind strangers forever." As Harold stormed out, Eleanor sagged against her unlikely protector, only then realizing she was still gripping his hand like a lifeline. The stranger guided Eleanor to his table with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the steel she'd glimpsed moments before. As they sat, she became acutely aware that every eye in the saloon was upon them, whispers following in their wake like tumbleweeds. "Thank you," she breathed, finally releasing his hand. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "Name's Jake," he interrupted, signaling the bartender for another glass. "Jake Morrison. And you'd be Eleanor Whitmore, I'm guessing." She nodded, studying his face in the lamplight. There was something familiar about him, though she was certain they'd never met. "Have we? Do I know you from somewhere?" Jake's smile was enigmatic as he poured whiskey into the fresh glass and slid it toward her. "Drink this. You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor had never touched alcohol in her life, but the events of the evening had shattered many of her previous convictions. She took a tentative sip and immediately regretted it, coughing as the liquid burned her throat. Jake chuckled, the sound rich and warm. "First time? Is it that obvious?" She gasped, her eyes watering. "Honey, you stick out in here like a Sunday dress at a barn raisin'. What's a lady like you doing in a place like this, running from an ex-husband who looks like he's never seen the business end of a shovel?" Eleanor found herself telling him everything. The arranged marriage to Harold, his controlling nature, the way he'd isolated her from friends and family, and finally her desperate flight west when she'd discovered he'd been stealing from her inheritance. Jake listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. "So you came all the way to Redemption Creek to start over?" he asked when she finished. "I have a cousin here, Mary Patterson. She married a rancher and wrote that there might be work for me at the schoolhouse." Eleanor twisted her wedding ring. She hadn't been able to bring herself to remove it yet. "I just need to disappear long enough for Harold to give up and go home." Jake's expression grew thoughtful. "Eleanor, darling, men like your ex-husband don't give up easy. Especially when there's money involved." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. He followed you all the way out here, which means he's either real determined or real desperate. Maybe both." Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping. "A man don't chase a woman across half the country just for love." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. Harold had never loved her. Their marriage had been a business arrangement between their fathers. "But her inheritance? He needs my money," she whispered. "His family's business has been struggling. That's why he was so angry about the divorce." "It's not about me at all. Now you're starting to see clear." Jake's hand covered hers briefly, the contact sending that same electric jolt through her. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Eleanor could answer, the saloon doors swung open again. This time it wasn't Harold who entered, but Sheriff Tom Bradley, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Jake Morrison," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "Figured I might find you here." Eleanor felt Jake tense beside her, though his expression remained relaxed. "Evening, Sheriff. What brings you by?" "Got word there was some trouble earlier. Something about a disagreement over a lady?" Sheriff Bradley's gaze moved to Eleanor, taking in her obvious distress and expensive clothing. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Bradley." "Are you all right?" "She's fine, Tom," Jake said before Eleanor could respond. "Just a misunderstanding with her ex-husband. Nothing that couldn't be sorted out with a little conversation." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "That wouldn't be the fancy Eastern fellow who's been asking questions around town, would it? Harold something or other?" Eleanor's heart sank. "He's been asking about me." "For the better part of a week," Sheriff Bradley confirmed. "Seems real anxious to find his beloved wife, who he claims has taken ill and wandered off." His tone suggested he hadn't believed a word of Harold's story. "We're divorced," Eleanor said firmly. "I have the papers to prove it." "Well then, that settles that." The sheriff tipped his hat to her, then fixed Jake with a meaningful look. "Jake, might I have a word?" "Outside?" Eleanor watched nervously as the two men stepped onto the saloon's front porch. Through the window, she could see them engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Other patrons had returned to their drinks and card games, but she caught several men glancing in her direction with expressions she couldn't quite read. When Jake returned, his demeanor had shifted subtly. There was a new tension in his shoulders, and his eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Everything all right?" Eleanor asked. "Sheriff just wanted to make sure you were here of your own free will," Jake replied, but she sensed there was more to it. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think real careful before you answer." "What is it?" "How much do you know about Redemption Creek?" "About the folks who live here?" Eleanor frowned at the odd question. "Just what my cousin Mary told me in her letters. It's a small town, mostly ranchers and miners." "Why?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "No reason. Just curious." He stood abruptly. "It's getting late. You got somewhere to stay tonight?" "The boarding house, I hope. Mrs. Henderson said she might have a room. I'll walk you over. Make sure you get settled safe." As they prepared to leave, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed during Jake's conversation with the sheriff. The easy camaraderie they'd shared was still there, but underneath it lay currents she didn't understand. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Sheriff Bradley's warning had been simple and direct. "Jake, that woman's trouble, and you know it. Harold Whitmore's got connections back east, and if he disappears or turns up dead, they're gonna come looking. You've worked too hard to build a new life here to throw it all away for a pretty face." And Jake's response had been equally direct. "Tom, some things are worth the risk." The morning sun painted Redemption Creek in shades of gold and amber as Eleanor made her way to the schoolhouse, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Mrs. Henderson had indeed had a room available, and after a night of actual peaceful sleep, Eleanor felt ready to begin her new life. The teaching position was hers if she wanted it. The previous teacher had married and moved to California, leaving the town's children without proper education. She was so absorbed in planning her first lessons that she almost missed the commotion near the general store. A crowd had gathered around a man on horseback, a stranger with the hard look of someone accustomed to violence. Eleanor's blood chilled as she recognized the type, a bounty hunter. "I'm looking for Jake Morrison," the man announced, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Also goes by Jake Blackjack Morrison. There's a $1,000 reward for information leading to his capture." Eleanor's world tilted. Blackjack Morrison. Even sheltered as she'd been in Boston society, she'd heard that name whispered in newspapers and dime novels. The most feared gunfighter in the West, responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen men. A killer who'd disappeared 3 years ago after a particularly bloody shootout in Tombstone. The man who'd held her hand. Who'd protected her. Who'd made her feel safer than she had in years. "Ain't seen hide nor hair of any Jake Morrison," old Pete from the livery stable was saying. "You sure you got the right town, mister?" Eleanor backed away from the crowd, her mind reeling. She had to find Jake, to warn him, to understand, to... what? What did one say to a man who'd killed more people than she could count? She found him behind the boarding house, grooming a magnificent black stallion that looked as dangerous as its owner. In the daylight, she could see details she'd missed the night before. The way he wore his guns, low and tied down like a professional. The scars on his hands that spoke of violence. The alertness in his posture that suggested he was always ready for trouble. "You heard," he said without looking up from the horse's flank. "The whole town's heard by now." Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. "Is it true? Are you really Blackjack Morrison?" Jake's hand stilled on the brush. "That depend on what you're going to do with the answer." "I don't know." The honesty surprised them both. "I should be terrified. I should run screaming. But you saved me last night. You were kind to me. You listened." She stepped closer, studying his profile. "The man I met last night, was any of that real?" Finally, Jake turned to face her, and she saw something vulnerable in his storm-gray eyes. "More real than I've been in years, darling. More real than I probably deserve to be. Tell me," she said simply. Jake was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, leaning against his horse, he began to speak. "Started when I was 16. My family had a small ranch outside of El Paso. Mexican bandits came through one night, killed my parents, my little sister, left me for dead." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Eleanor could hear the old pain underneath. "When I healed up, I went after them. Found them too. Killed every last one." Eleanor's hand went to her throat, but she didn't speak. "Word got around that I was fast with a gun. Men started seeking me out, wanting to prove they were faster. I tried to walk away, tried to find honest work, but..." He shrugged. Reputation's a hard thing to outrun. Every town I went to, someone would recognize me, challenge me, and I was young and angry and stupid enough to keep accepting. How many? The question slipped out before she could stop it. 17 men in fair fights. 3 more that weren't so fair. Jake's jaw tightened. I ain't proud of it, Eleanor. But I ain't gonna lie to you either. And you came here to hide? Came here to die, actually. The admission was so quiet she almost missed it. 3 years ago, I was tired. Tired of running, tired of killing, tired of being afraid to sleep too deep or trust too easy. Figured I'd find some young gun looking to make a name for himself and let him put me out of my misery. What changed? Jake's smile was soft and sad. This town, these people, they knew who I was. Tom Bradley recognized me the first day I rode in. But instead of running me out or turning me in, they gave me a chance to be someone else. I've been Jake Morrison, horse trainer and occasional ranch hand, for 3 years now. First time in my adult life I've had friends who don't want something from me. Eleanor absorbed this, her mind working furiously. The bounty hunter. We'll keep looking until he finds me or gives up. $1,000 is a lot of money. Jake's hand moved unconsciously toward his gun. I should ride out. Tonight, probably. Before he starts asking the right questions to the wrong people. No. The word came out more forcefully than Eleanor intended. You can't run forever. Watch me. What about your life here? Your friends? What about... She stopped herself before she could say, what about me? But Jake's knowing look suggested he'd heard it anyway. Eleanor, honey, I'm a killer. Maybe I've been playing at being something else for a few years, but that don't change what I am. What I've done. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. You deserve better than a man with blood on his hands and a price on his head. Don't I get to decide what I deserve? The question hung between them like a challenge. Jake reached out, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Eleanor caught his hand, holding it against her face. I know you're dangerous. I know you've killed people. I know there are probably a dozen reasons why I should be afraid of you. She took a shaky breath. But I also know that when I needed help, you didn't hesitate. When I was scared, you made me feel safe. When I told you my story, you didn't judge me. Eleanor, I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. Jake, I'm asking you to be who you are now. Here, with me. Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. Sheriff Bradley was riding hard toward the boarding house, his face grim. Jake, he called out as he dismounted. We got trouble. That bounty hunter's been talking to folks and someone's told him about last night. About you and the lady. His eyes moved to Eleanor. Ma'am, I'm afraid your ex-husband's involved himself in this mess. He's offered to double the bounty if Morrison's brought in alive. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Harold's working with the bounty hunter? Seems he figures if he can't have you, he'll make sure you don't have anyone else either. Sheriff Bradley's expression was apologetic but determined. Jake, you need to ride out. Now, before this gets any worse. Jake was already moving toward his horse, his movements efficient and practiced. Eleanor watched in growing panic as he began securing his saddlebags. Take me with you, she said suddenly. Both men stared at her. Eleanor, no, Jake said firmly. This ain't some romantic adventure. Men are gonna die before this is over. Men are going to die anyway, she shot back. And I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting other people control my life. She lifted her chin defiantly. Besides, you said it yourself, Harold won't give up. If you leave me here, he'll just find another way to get to me. Sheriff Bradley looked between them, then sighed heavily. She's got a point, Jake. And frankly, I'd rather have you both where I can keep an eye on you than scattered to the four winds. Jake's internal struggle was visible on his face. Finally, he cursed under his breath and turned to Eleanor. If you come with me, there's no going back. No changing your mind when things get rough. You understand? Eleanor thought of her comfortable life in Boston, of the safe, predictable future she'd planned as a school teacher in Redemption Creek. Then she thought of the way Jake had looked at her the night before, as if she were something precious and worth protecting. I understand, she said, and meant it. The abandoned mining camp of Silver Creek sat like a ghost in the desert, its weathered buildings and empty streets bearing witness to dreams long dead. Jake had chosen it carefully. High ground, multiple escape routes, and far enough from Redemption Creek to keep innocent folks out of the crossfire. As he helped Eleanor down from her horse, he couldn't help but admire her grit. 3 days of hard riding, sleeping under the stars, and eating trail rations, and she hadn't complained once. "You sure about this plan?" Eleanor asked, checking the small derringer Jake had insisted she carry. Her hands were steadier than he'd expected for someone who'd never held a weapon before. "Sure as I can be about anything involving your ex-husband and a bounty hunter," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the surrounding hills. "Harold's too proud to let this go, and Crenshaw's too greedy." "They'll come." Sheriff Bradley emerged from the old assay office where he'd been setting up their defensive position. "Riders coming from the south. Looks like our guests have arrived." Jake felt the familiar calm settle over him, the same deadly stillness that had kept him alive through 17 gunfights. But this time was different. This time, he had something to lose. "Eleanor, you remember what we discussed?" She nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. "Stay in the assay office. Don't come out no matter what I hear." "If something happens to you," she swallowed hard. "If something happens to you, I ride hard for the Mexican border and don't look back. That's my girl." Jake cupped her face in his hands, memorizing every detail. "Eleanor, I need you to know." "Tell me after," she interrupted, standing on her toes to kiss him briefly. "Tell me everything after." As Eleanor disappeared into the building, Jake and Sheriff Bradley took their positions. The approaching riders resolved into 3 figures. Harold Whitmore, looking absurdly out of place in his eastern finery. Crenshaw, the bounty hunter, all leather and steel and predatory patience. And a third man Jake didn't recognize, probably one of Crenshaw's associates. They stopped about 50 yards out, well within rifle range but far enough to talk. "Morrison." Crenshaw called out, "I'm here for the bounty, nothing personal. You come quiet, and nobody else has to get hurt." "Can't do that, Crenshaw," Jake replied, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "See, I got myself a new life now. Ain't inclined to give it up." Harold spurred his horse forward, his face flushed with anger and heat. "Where is she, Morrison?"
"Where's my wife?"
"Ex-wife," Jake corrected. "And she's somewhere you'll never find her. You think you can steal what's mine?" Harold's voice cracked with fury. "I'll see you hang before I let some common criminal take what belongs to me." Jake's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Mister, the only thing common about me is my willingness to kill men who threaten what I care about." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "Harold Whitmore, you're under arrest for conspiracy and attempted kidnapping." "You have the right to." Crenshaw's rifle spoke first, the bullet taking the sheriff in the shoulder and spinning him around. Jake's Colt was in his hand before Bradley hit the ground, but the bounty hunter was already moving, using Harold's horse as cover. The third man tried to circle around to Jake's left, but Jake had been expecting it. His first shot took the man center mass, dropping him from his saddle. His second shot missed Crenshaw by inches, splintering the wooden post the bounty hunter had ducked behind. "You're fast, Morrison," Crenshaw called out, "but I've been hunting men like you for 20 years. You can't watch all directions at once." Jake was already moving, using the old buildings for cover as he worked his way closer to his opponents. Harold had dismounted and was crouched behind a water trough, his expensive pistol shaking in his hands. The man was clearly terrified, but desperation made even cowards dangerous. A bullet whined past Jake's ear, and he rolled behind an overturned wagon. Crenshaw was good, better than most of the men Jake had faced. But Jake had advantages the bounty hunter didn't know about. He knew this terrain, and he was fighting for something more important than money. Eleanor. Harold's voice rose to a shriek. "I know you're here." "Come out now, and I'll make this quick." That was his mistake. The moment Harold revealed his position by shouting, Jake was moving. He came around the wagon low and fast, his Colt barking twice. The first bullet shattered Harold's gun hand. The second took him in the leg, dropping him screaming to the dirt. But Jake's focus on Harold had given Crenshaw the opening he needed. The bounty hunter's rifle cracked, and Jake felt the bullet tear through his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him stumbling. "Got you now?" "Morrison," Crenshaw said, stepping into the open with his rifle trained on Jake's chest. "Should have taken my offer." Jake's right hand was still steady, his Colt still loaded, but Crenshaw had the drop on him. Time seemed to slow as the bounty hunter's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot that rang out wasn't from Crenshaw's rifle. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the assay office, the smoking derringer in her hands and tears streaming down her face. Crenshaw looked down in surprise at the spreading red stain on his chest. then toppled forward into the dust. "I told you to stay inside," Jake said weakly, pressing his hand to his wounded shoulder. "And I told you I was tired of letting other people control my life," Eleanor replied, dropping the derringer and running to his side. "Besides, someone had to watch your back." Sheriff Bradley, his own wound bound with strips torn from his shirt, was already securing Harold with handcuffs. "Well," he said with a pained grin, "that's one way to handle a domestic dispute." Harold was sobbing now, clutching his shattered hand. "You don't understand. I need that money. My family's business, your family's business ain't Eleanor's problem anymore," Jake said, allowing Eleanor to help him to his feet. "And neither are you." As the sun began to set over Silver Creek, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor worked to bandage Jake's shoulder with supplies from Sheriff Bradley's saddlebags. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. Jake winced as she tightened the bandage. "Well, Crenshaw's dead, so the bounty dies with him. Harold's going to prison for conspiracy and attempted murder. And He looked down at her, his gray eyes soft. "I reckon I go back to being Jake Morrison, horse trainer and occasional ranch hand." "Just Jake Morrison?" "Well," Jake said, his voice taking on that familiar drawl, "I was hoping maybe Jake Morrison, husband to the prettiest schoolteacher in the territory." "If she'll have a reformed gunfighter with a questionable past and a tendency to attract trouble." Eleanor's smile was radiant as the desert sunset. "I think she might be persuaded. After all, she's got a tendency to attract trouble herself." Sheriff Bradley chuckled from where he sat propped against a rock. "You two are going to give me gray hair, you know that?" "Tom," Jake said seriously, "I want you to know. Jake, you saved this town from a range war 2 years ago when the Cattlemen's Association tried to muscle out the small ranchers. You've helped more folks than I can count, and you've never once used your reputation for anything but protecting people who needed it." The sheriff's expression was earnest. "Far as I'm concerned, Blackjack Morrison died 3 years ago. All I see here is Jake Morrison, and he's welcome in Redemption Creek for as long as he wants to stay." As they prepared for the ride back to town, Eleanor slipped her hand into Jake's uninjured one. "You know, I never did get to teach those children their first lesson. What were you planning to teach them?" Eleanor's eyes sparkled with mischief. "That sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. And that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Sounds like a lesson their teacher learned pretty well herself." "I had a good example," Eleanor replied, then added with a grin that would have scandalized her Boston relatives, "Besides, every school marm needs a little excitement in her life." Jake's laughter echoed across the desert as they rode toward home, toward a future neither of them had dared to imagine just a week before. Behind them, the ghost town of Silver Creek settled back into silence, keeping its secrets and its stories for the wind and the stars. In Redemption Creek, the church bells would ring for their wedding 3 months later, and the whole town would turn out to celebrate the union of their reformed gunfighter and the Eastern lady who'd been brave enough to grab a stranger's hand and change both their lives forever. But that's a story for another day.